Like to kick things off by taking us to, let's say, the year 1806, when Boston entrepreneur Frederick Tudor decided to sail to the Martinique Islands with a precious cargo. He had harvested ice from frozen rivers in Massachusetts, and he thought he could make a killing selling this to the islanders in the tropics of the Martinique. There was only one small problem in his plan. The islanders had never really ever had a cold drink. They did not know about this thing called ice cream, nor had they ever really tried anything like refrigeration. So they found this substance to be an interesting curiosity, but one of no value. And as a consequence, its precious value melted away, unsold and underappreciated. Now, I bring up the story of Frederick Tudor just to make one point, which is that often the fate of events economic, or of social events, or of human affairs depend not so much on what people know or what people can conceive of, but rather depend on what people don't know, what they can conceive of, what lies beyond their imagination. For lack of a better term, things that they are ignorant of, if you will. Now, as Andrew mentioned, I'm a psychologist, and my wheelhouse, so to speak, is the study of human misbelief, how people come to believe things that simply aren't true or cannot be true. And as soon as you begin to work into this topic, you begin to realize that ignorance is the story. And towards that end, I want to make 3 points about ignorance today that I think we will find of interest in the intersection between psychology and economics. The first point to make about ignorance is uncontroversial, I think. And that's quite simply that we all live under the shadow of our own inevitable ignorance. They're just simply things we don't know, either as individuals or as a species. I mean, Karl Popper pointed out quite eloquently that our knowledge, though fantastic, is by definition finite, but what we don't know is by definition infinite. It just extends way far out into the distance. I think we can all agree on that. What might be a little more controversial is how closely our ignorance begins to ourselves and our daily affairs. What I'd like to argue today is that where the boundary line between what we know and what we don't know, that boundary line lies well within the geography of our everyday lives. It's a boundary line that we may cross several times during our lifetimes, or maybe even several times during the day. I mean, if you take a look, for example, at magazines, newspapers, websites, every 2 or 3 months they are publishing some sort of story of what people, usually people means Americans, what Americans don't know about their history, about their government, about financial affairs, about health, about religion. And the headline is actually how little people know. But it's the third point that might be the most controversial, so I'm going to dwell on it a little bit with data today. And that third point about ignorance is this boundary line that lies so close to us. By the cruelest irony, that turns out to be something that we are ignorant of as well. We don't know the times that we walk off the solid ground of our knowledge into the thin air of things we don't know. Often we may find ourselves acting out of ignorance more than knowledge and not know the fact because we don't know the boundary line between what we know and what we don't know. We don't know the limits of our knowledge. As the title of the talk indicates, ignorance often refuses, or rather can't, recognize itself. Now, I feel like I need to do, I'm a psychologist, so I feel I have to do a little demonstration of this fact with data. There are a number of ways we can take a look at the fact that people don't know the limits of their knowledge. Here's one simple way that was published about 2 years ago, in which we simply went to people and asked them were they familiar or knowledgeable about these common everyday financial terms. And as you can tell, they're common everyday financial terms. Except I want to focus on the last 3 terms because they're interesting to us. Because 91% of our respondents said that they were familiar or knowledgeable about at least one of these topics. There's only one problem with that. These topics don't exist. They were things we made up in my office and then went to Google and made sure they don't exist out in the world. People don't know exactly where their knowledge ends and where everything else begins, or Karl Popper's term begins. This is a little bit more complicated, but this is, in my lab, what we're known for. Another demonstration that people don't necessarily know what they don't know. This is a graph depicting data that came from a study in which we approached students just as they were finishing an exam in a mid-level psychology course at Cornell University, hundreds of students. And we just simply asked the students how well had they done on the exam. That's the first thing we did. Second thing we did is we asked them if we could look up their actual score when the exams were graded. And based on that actual score, what we did is we sorted people into the bottom 25% of performers, the second 25%, the third, and then finally the top 25% of performers. And basically the blue line indicates how well everybody in each group did. Now, for us, what's interesting is the relation of the blue line to the two other lines, which aren't about how people actually did, it's about how well people thought they did. The red line indicates people's beliefs about their mastery of the course material in general. The yellow dotted line indicates how well people thought they did on the actual exam. Now, if you take a look at this graph, there are two findings I want to point out. Actually, there are 4 findings in the graph. I just want to point out 2 of them. The first is if you take a look at how people rated their exam performance, on average, people think they're doing quite well. They're much closer to the top than they are at the bottom of the scale. Basically, what people are doing is they're saying they're above average in their performance. That's what the average person says, that they're above average. That's not a surprise. If you ask people about their driving ability, their leadership ability, they will tend to tell you that they're above average, but that can't be. For example. In one survey of professors, 94% of them said they did above average work. Now, I have many splendid colleagues. The figure is not 94% doing above average work. That's the first finding. The second finding is that if you take a look at bottom performers, they're almost as positive in how well they think they're doing on this exam as our top performers. They're not as confident, but they're almost as confident. And they're certainly much more confident in how well they think they've done relative to how well they've actually done. And this is a gap that we have looked at quite a bit in my lab, this gap between, for poor performers, how well they think they're doing versus how poorly they're really doing. People seem to have, when they're, for lack of a better term, incompetent, seem to have very little recognition of how incompetent or how poorly they're doing. That gap has come to be known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, for those of you who thought Dunning sounded familiar. And it basically refers to the fact that incompetent people do not, scratch that, cannot know how incompetent they're doing. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second point I'd like to make is Justin Kruger and I did not name it the Dunning-Kruger effect. It was named for us, and we've resigned ourselves to the fact that our good family names will be associated with poor performance, incompetence, ignorance, gullibility, naivete, and stupidity, and nincompoopery. But so it goes. Now, just in case you might think that might be a reflection of youth, that people don't know when they're doing poorly, we can go to this has been looked at in a number of settings. Let me just go to a more important classroom, let's say. Let's take a look at a survey over 10 years done at the University of Florida Medical School of medical residents going through their OBGYN rotation or clerkship. And basically, if you take a look, you get the same effect here in terms of what grades students think they're going to get, particularly if they're doing poorly, relative to the actual grades they're about to receive through the mail. And finally, if you're worried that people are being sloppy or just flattering in terms of the ratings they give themselves, we've done studies where we've offered people up to $100 to tell us accurately how well they're doing, either in terms of percentile ranking or in terms of raw score. And I can tell you that if you offer people up to $100 for giving you an accurate impression, you get their attention. What you don't get is any more accuracy. That is, you take a look at the green lines, these are the perception lines, this is the reality line. it almost overlaps completely with the same line that you're getting in the control condition. Now, first question. Why is it that people don't know the limits of their knowledge frequently, or ignorance fails to recognize itself? Now, there are many stories that I can tell. I just want to dwell on one story today because it comes up again in the talk, and it comes up again in a lot of different ways whenever you're doing this research. And that has to do with the fact that, quite frankly, we have to be upfront about this. All of us knows a lot. By the time we're 60 years old, the average English speaker knows 48,000 words, can recognize hundreds of people. In fact, one psychologist estimated that humans wrapped around their neurons know about 1.5 times 10 to the 9th bits of information. But it would be hubris to think that all those bits of information are accurate. Some of them are wrong, some of them are misleading, some of them lead to misleading conclusions, and that turns out to be a problem. Now, in 2014, in my lab, what we decided to do the day after the 2014 congressional election was survey about 350 people in terms of what they thought about social conditions and political conditions and economic conditions in the United States. And here are 4 items that we surveyed them on out of the collection of items, the total collection. As you can see, 2 of the items are rather friendly to a liberal point of view. 2 of the items are friendly to a conservative point of view. You might reflect upon the fact which items you think are true and which items are false, because 2 of those items are true, and 2 of those items as of 2014 are false. Any guesses? That's the problem. We know a lot of things that are true, but we also unfortunately tend to know a lot of things that are false. And that has implications for what we think about ourselves and for our decisions. That is, it's not a surprise in our survey that if you took a look at conservative facts, facts that lean toward a conservative point of view, conservatives were much more likely to endorse them as true than liberals. And you got a reflection of that for liberal facts. Liberals were much more likely to endorse them as true relative to conservatives. But what's interesting is the following. The blue part of the bar indicates those facts that are actually true. The red bar indicates those things that are actually false. And about 35 to 40% of what respondents on each side indicated as true actually was demonstrably false, if you went and you looked at the relevant statistics, for example. We know a lot of things. It's remarkable what we know. It would be hubris to think that they're all right. But here's the problem. If you take a look at how we treat the things that we know that are wrong, you get into an issue. Now, one of the things we did in this study is we asked people how well-informed a voter they were, and then looked to see how that related to how well they'd done our little political quiz. And the first thing I can tell you is those people who got more right actually rated themselves as more well-informed than those people who didn't. So people have some handle on some form of their knowledge about political affairs. And what's also good is when a person said, I don't know the answer to that question, they rated themselves as less informed of a voter. Those two graphs or weights are straightforward. What's important, though, is what happens when people gave a demonstrably wrong answer to our question. What happened is they gave that positive weight. That is, to the extent that our respondents gave an answer that was wrong, they also tended to consider themselves as a more informed voter. So the problem with self-perception is we give ourselves almost as much credit for our wrong ideas as we do to our right ideas. Now, what sort of implications does this idea have, either the general idea or the specific idea? Well, the accent on the conference is on education, and I think the fact that ignorance tends not to recognize itself does have a tremendous, reveals a tremendous issue that we have to deal with more, I think, as educators, which is illustrated by data that actually comes out of a class that I taught about 2 years ago at Cornell University. The topic was psych and law, and what we did is we simply, in the first week of the class, asked people were they familiar with these psycholegal terms that we were going to ultimately talk about in class. Of course, some of those terms were not real. We made them up in my office, so any familiarity that people expressed had to be wrong. And it turned out in the first week of class, about 40% of these fake items were recognized, or rather students said they knew something about them, both in my class and in a control class. Now the question becomes, what happens when we return the students at the end of the class? What have we taught, or what have I taught students in this instance? And we basically gave the same questionnaire. In the control class, nothing much else different happened. In my class, of the items we'd actually talked about in class, I'm pleased to tell you that students expressed familiarity and knowledge with over 90% of those items. I'm very, very happy about that. I am unhappy about the fact that the fake items, almost 90% of students, or 90% of the time, endorsed knowledge of these items ideas, concepts, we had never touched in class. So either my students are very over-exuberant in their learning, or I'm overly exuberant in my teaching. But I think what this is a demonstration of one thing. Whenever we're educators, our aim is to fill people with knowledge, but sometimes we can fill them with a misapprehension of what they have learned. We can fill them with overconfidence if we're not careful in the ways that we instruct people. And this is perhaps one demonstration of that. And that does suggest different ways of approaching teaching. Right now, in educational psychology, instructors begin to realize that the real problem of teaching people isn't so much being able to efficiently fill their heads with knowledge, but rather recognizing that students don't walk in as blank slates. They walk in with misapprehensions. They walk in with misconceptions. And those misconceptions often are tremendous barriers to the students learning anything new that you have to offer them. For example, in psychology, the classic misconception that we only use 10% of our brains is still out there. Many people believe that. Can't be true. The brain uses too much oxygen and calories. It's too luxurious to be such a lazy organ. But in order to really talk about how the brain works, you do have to address, confront, and ultimately refute misconceptions that are like that, or the misconception that we only have 5 senses. We actually have many more than 5 senses. And this has been shown by researchers. This is data from one study that was done teaching high school psychology in Tampa, Florida, where what they did is they instituted a unit in which they surveyed, identified, and then refuted misconceptions students had about psychological topics, and then went ahead and taught the new stuff. And what they found is if they instituted a refutational style of teaching, they actually got more information gain, more learning on the part of students than compared to a standard, their standard way of teaching the material, or a control condition in which students didn't receive the material altogether. One of the things we have to worry about are the misconceptions our students have. If you don't pay attention to them, well, students may not necessarily pay attention to you in the way that you're thinking. That's one implication. The second implication that I think it's important to think about is in terms of policy, which is to the extent that psychologists or economists are interested in policy, there is a problem, which is what if you instituted a policy but no one knew of it? They remained ignorant of it. Will your policy be effective? One of the most effective policies for alleviating poverty in the last few decades has been the institution of the Earned Income Tax Credit. This is a program in which poor families can earn up to $6,000 simply by filing a tax return. It does amazing stuff in terms of alleviating poverty. The issue with it is that if you ask the IRS will tell you that 1 out of every 5 people who are eligible don't bother to participate in the program. And you can ask the question, why do 1 out of 5 people who are eligible, when there's money on the table, why do they fail to take part? It turns out when you do the study, and the study was published in the American Economic Review about 2 years ago, that it's not the stigma of applying for it. That doesn't appear to be a problem whatsoever. Or that people think it's too effortful to apply for the Earned Income Tax Credit. That doesn't seem to be the issue. They simply don't know about the Earned Income Tax Credit. It remains something that they don't know exists or they don't know that they're eligible for. And in fact, in this study published in AER, what the researchers did was simply inform in a very simple brochure 35,000 non-applicants that this program existed. And that caused 23% of them to sign up for the program the next time it came around. If they also included a simple way for the recipient to figure out how much money they could earn, take-up increased by 33%. One of the problems we have often in thinking about the effectiveness or the efficiency of things that we're trying to do is recognizing the fact that there is a silent opponent that might be opposing us, and that is the opponent of ignorance, something that as psychologists I think we're beginning to consider more and more. Now, my time is short, so I want to leave you with just one last word, and that last word is hypocognition. And if you don't know what that word means, or you've never heard it before, congratulations, you've just experienced hypocognition. Hypocognition is the state of not having a cognitive or linguistic representation for some thing, some object, some idea, or some concept. Like the Martinique Islanders didn't have a concept of ice or its uses. They were hypocognitive of the idea of ice. The more psychologists play around with this idea of hypocognition, that ignorance matters, and not only that, ignorance of ignorance matters. We find some incredibly fascinating, interesting, paradoxical, humorous, and sometimes very distressing stories to tell. And maybe what I can do is invite economists also to think about this idea of hypocognition. One can assume complete information, or potentially one can presume no information and see how that would play out in various models, in various settings that might be out there in the world. I imagine there are some amazing, distressing, humorous, paradoxical, interesting stories to find out by assuming ignorance or hypocognition out there, though I have to concede that I have no idea what they might be. Let me end there.